I'd really like to start just interviewing artists who have a track record of like continuing to sort of pursue their craft and pursue the art,
Yeah.
because I think that's unique um,
Yeah.
in the creative field. Most like I think a lot of artists sort of end up giving up their craft to pursue like bigger careers, or taking really
Right.
long hiatuses. And so, yeah, so that is sort of the goal.
Yeah, I'll dive right in because I've done both. I've given up my craft in order to have a career, and then I gave up my career in order to pursue my craft.
Nice. Okay,
Um,
great.
so I'll tell you the first part, and then I'll tell you the second part. I grew up in a musical family. My mother was a cellist. We were surrounded by music, and she took us to concerts. When I was 4, I asked her for a cello. She gave me a little half-size cello, and I didn't really get around to paying much attention to it until I was maybe in about second grade. Then I really got into it, and she pretty soon took me to study with her teacher because, I couldn't really learn from my mother too well, because that's how that is. I studied with Miss Enix for a number of years, and I was really into it. And I eventually, in my teens, was able to study with a teacher who was the principal cellist with the London Symphony and with the London Philharmonic. He came to Florida, where I lived, and it was going to be a sabbatical for him, but he ended up staying for a number of years. His name was Nelson Cook. He was a magnificent cellist. He had a Stradivarius, and he took me to my first audition for an orchestra, and I got in at the age of 17 to the Florida Gulf Coast Symphony. I had a very sort of multifaceted musical interest, and when I got into college, I fell in with some bluegrass musicians and started thinking that I would just make my own music, not necessarily be in classical music exclusively. And I went on the road with this guitar player. Eventually, I made my way to Nashville, Tennessee, where I came to be in the symphony there. I was able to be in the Nashville Symphony, which is a major orchestra. It's maybe one of the, I would say, top 5, certainly in the top 10 major orchestras in the country. And somewhere along the line, I met a woman. I thought that I needed to be in some kind of business in order to raise a family. And I did that. I left the symphony. I did various kinds of sales and marketing jobs for, I want to say, almost probably around 30 years. And then a little over 10 years ago, I really just came to the conclusion that I'm supposed to be a musician. It was very interesting because a lot of it had to do with simply taking on the identity of being a musician. If you tell yourself you're an artist, you can be an artist, not because it's like, nobody gives you permission to do that. You're the one that gives you permission. And you don't know how to do it. There are established channels, in the musical world, the established channels, especially for a classical instrument like cello, are playing in an orchestra and becoming a teacher. But I had much more creative aspirations. I wanted to compose. I wanted to perform my own work. So the chapter of my story that has to do with my musical artist life starts with the fact that basically all of my efforts to, you could say, make money any other way had failed. I don't know whether you know the concept of dharma. Have you heard that word, dharma?
I've heard that before, but I'm not entirely sure what it means.
It's spelled Dharma, and it's a Sanskrit term which means being in alignment with the laws of nature. So in the Vedas, it's considered that you need to follow your path of dharma. I would say that for me, for a big portion of my life, when I was pursuing all of these goals, supporting other people's efforts and being a salesperson and managing a telemarketing department and all these things, I really just wasn't ever cut out to do that, even though, as you know, there's a big pressure from society that that's what you have to do. You have to have some sort of career that's in some kind of mainstream, although, almost anyone will agree those are some of the most boring things that you can do,
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
and not, not always. I mean, there's some redemption in many, many different career fields, but especially if you have what we could call either the curse or the blessing of being a creative person, you are going to face the risk of how do I make something out of that? And so what happened for me was I made a very simple choice, which was I'm just going to play my cello for people whenever they ask me to. And cool. It was basically that fundamental. I had tried and failed over and over again to create an overarching plan of how this could work out. So I really just fell back to, okay, if you want me to, I'm going to play my cello for you, And what happened was I was living in Ashland at the time. A friend of mine let me know that there was an opportunity to play in the stage orchestra of a Broadway musical that was being put on in the Midwest. And they needed a cellist for this it was a 7-piece stage orchestra. I was the only cellist in the stage orchestra. So I played in the stage orchestra. And while I was in this little town in the Midwest doing this job, a friend of mine invited me to perform in the evening for her friends in her home. I was playing a rented cello at the time. Part and parcel of doing the work that you're really not cut out for is that you don't succeed well enough to be able to make a lot of money. And so I was just playing a rented cello to get this gig and just try to get my thing off the ground. So when Denise asked me to play at her little evening gathering, I almost said no, because I didn't really have a repertoire. I hadn't prepared to perform an hour or something of music. In the moment when she asked me, I said to myself, well, this is it. This is what I'm saying I want to do. I've got to say yes, And so I determined at that moment to make an evening of sharing a Mary Oliver poem, improvising in between the stanzas of this Mary Oliver poem. It was a poem from the book, The Leaf and the Cloud, which is a beautiful book of prose poems. And it was a poem called Flare, which is a really gorgeous poem of hers, long poem that kind of reflects on her life and also reflects on sort of the opening of a day. So I did this. I came to Denise's house and she had a gathering of friends and I shared the poem and I played extemporaneously. I improvised. I did this poem At the end of the performance, a woman that I had known from a number of years earlier came up and said, "It's very beautiful what you're doing, but this cello that you're playing doesn't really seem to be of the caliber that you need to do what you're trying to do." And I said, "Well, that's true, but it would take about $10,000 to get the kind of instrument I really need." And she said, "Well, I have $10,000 and I would like to give you an instrument." So,
sure, okay.
so I walked around in a circle for a few minutes, not really believing what I had just heard.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And she said, "Well, you can think about it," but upon thinking about it, I thought that was a very good idea. And we went to this music store in Iowa City and picked out this instrument. And there's actually quite a bit more backstory that makes this even more magical than it was at the time. But it was a magical, miraculous, kind of a moment where, the air traffic controllers are, flashing their lights to get you to land the plane. Like, you're supposed to be a musician, so here's a fucking cello,
Right.
And, it's kind of like King Arthur getting the sword. This is what you're supposed to do, Literally, almost from that moment on, a sequence of events took place that were all magical and miraculous. One of the things that happened was that I went home to Ashland. I was going to Lithia Park, which is this gorgeous park that was designed by the same designer as the Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. And I was going to hang out with my son, and he knew that I had this new cello. I had it in the car. He said he wanted to hear it, so I brought it into the park and I sat on the stone wall and I started playing. And I didn't even realize that I had left my case open, and people started putting money in my case. After about a half an hour, my son said to me, "Dad, look in your case." And there was like $25 in there in a half an hour. And I was like, okay, so I need to do this some more, And I messed around with that for a number of months, kind of sussing out when to go and where to set up, because busking, playing in public is a very particular art. A busker has to have what they call your pitch, which is the perfect place for you to set up and do the thing that you do. I discovered a particular place in that park, which is almost like a little amphitheater. The creek is behind me. There's benches in front of me. Behind that, there's a little meadow that people can set up and have a picnic and listen to the cello guy. By the spring of 2009, I was playing like at least 5 days a week at the park. I was making like enough money to support myself because, as it happens, it's a theater town. It's the home of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. There's a stream of tourists that come through, and what could be more magical than you're walking down the lane in the park, and there's this cello person doing his thing. So that was cool, and I did it the next season, but I realized that in the wintertime I was kind of screwed because there wasn't enough musical work to do in this valley to really make ends meet. And this was 2010 by this time, and the phenomena of house concerts had really just kind of tipped the scale. Like, people were starting to talk about house concerts, and mostly these were events that folk artists were doing. But I number one had the idea that I could do house concerts around the country. I signed up on Couchsurfing. I got in touch with my friends around the country. I bought a van that I called Van Gogh because really I only had a general impression of where I was going. And so it was an impressionist van. For the next 3 years, I was on the road doing house concerts. I did about 200 concerts. It was a strange and, again, kind of miraculous tour. And I told people that I was on tour, I had to admit to myself at some point that I was literally homeless, that I was making enough money to keep going, but I was not making enough money to have a home base. I wasn't really planning to come back to Ashland, but through a series of sort of fortuitous and bizarre events, doors being closed and doors being opened, I ended up back in Ashland. And let's then just go to a spring day in March of 2014. So I'd been on the road for 3 years. I came back to Ashland. I was staying with some friends. I came to the park. I said a prayer. God, if I'm supposed to do this, I need a sign. This needs to be like, I need some clarity. I don't know what the hell I'm doing. I played a little while and I noticed a group of young people, college age kids on the benches. Most of them wandered off, but there were a couple of young men who sang with me when I played Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah. I said, well, what are you guys doing here? And they said, well, we're part of a college choir and we're on a field trip. And within a few minutes, all of the kids came back. They lined up in front of me on the benches and on the wall, and they sang. They sang Hallelujah with me. They didn't just sing Hallelujah as I played, but it was the last thing they did on their field trip. They were all getting ready to get on the bus, and one by one, they came up to me and shook my hand and said, this is really beautiful what you're doing. You should keep doing this. So
there's your sign.
Once again, the air traffic controllers were waving their lights and saying, this is where you land the plane. I really believe that if anyone is choosing their lights, is choosing their calling, I really believe that if anyone is trying to find their way and they keep asking and they keep asking, they will have those moments of their air traffic controllers coming in and saying, this is how you land the plane, So for the last 4 years in the warm months, I've played in the park somewhere between 4 or 6 days a week. I always take 1 day off, maybe 2 days off a week. Through this, I've met, again, many magical people. A filmmaker approached me to do a soundtrack for his movie, which stimulated a desire that I had to make music for movies. And there have been a couple of other jobs like that have come because I did the soundtrack for his movie. One of the movies that I put music in actually got an award for the music. Little by little, I've had this desire to anchor what I'm doing with movie making, and I've both developed friendships and partnerships with movie makers here in town, and I've also developed to some extent my own skill with with videography, that looks like it's going to be the next phase of my work. I have about 8 CDs out by now, and a lot of what I was doing when I was on the road was spoken word. Basically involves taking the work of poets that I love, some Sufi poets, but a lot of really extraordinary American poets, and creating little soundtracks. I think of them as environments in which the emotional flow of these poems can be spoken, and so I still do that work. I still do some house concerts, not nearly as much. I'm really focusing more than anything else on the videography, and really through 2 main channels at this point. One is a nonprofit that I set up called Courageous Phenomena Music and Film, and our mission is to create a little team of creative musicians and videographers to make music and make films, documentary films about courageous people. And then I'm about to set up another website, basically daily postings of videos that I hope are beautiful. That's my intention, is to just like, I just saw, like, there's an incredible poet, Linda Gregg, who just passed away a couple days ago. I just saw a poem of hers called The Lamb, which is an extraordinary poem. I mean, I see that poem and I would go like, I need to share that with the world. So I'm going to create a little soundtrack for it, and I'll put it in a video, and that'll be one of my next things that I do. And, you know, it'll get done pretty quick. And, you know, I'll just keep doing stuff like that.